So we're going to look at One Need Not Be a Chamber to be Haunted. This one I found difficult at first, this poem. So if you read it and you're thinking, what on earth? That's completely normal. It's quite a haunting poem. It's quite a dark poem. It's about trauma, I think, is the main way to kind of think about it and explore it. So the main ideas, I think, in it are to do with psychology and the mind, and sometimes how ghosts can exist in the mind. So it's sort of like taking the idea of haunting and ghosts that are external and saying that actually they're less frightening than ones that you might have in your own head. So yeah, it's quite metaphorical in some ways, or symbolic. You could, if you believe in ghosts, also take it literally as something like a possession. So I want you to read the poem aloud to yourself just to get used to it, or you can just have a quick look at my recording of it as well. And then when you're ready, I'll go to the vocab. So the vocab, you want to just sort of pause and write anything down that's useful for you. Just kind of scroll through it a little slowly. There you go. Yeah, so we'll start with, I quite like this picture. It's obviously like a modern interpretation of the idea, but yeah, stuff to do with internal and external and the mind. Yeah. So the idea of it, if we go stanza by stanza, is that somebody doesn't have to be a room, or things don't have to be rooms or physical spaces to be haunted. We don't have to be a room or a house. The brain too has corridors, and in some ways those are easier to haunt than a physical place. If you encounter a ghost at midnight, it's safer that that would be an external ghost. So people are terrified of maybe seeing a ghost in reality, but it's nothing compared to the inside of your head, a ghost of the mind. Safer to gallop on a horse through a ruined abbey, which is a very Gothic image, being chased by stones than being unarmed and encountering yourself in a lonely place. So depression or mental illness or trauma that we can't recover from that's inside your mind is far scarier than anything that could be a danger to you outside. And so we have this idea that the true inner self is hidden behind the outer self that we know well and present to the world. So the world is not, the self is not a singular thing. We have layers to ourselves. And the thing that shocks us the most is the idea of having parts of ourselves that feel not natural to us, or maybe feel unfamiliar, like we don't understand ourselves well enough, and we do stuff that surprises us. And an assassin hiding in our apartment is a small kind of horror compared to the idea that you have these ghosts somewhere in your own mind. So the ending I find very intense. The body borrows a gun, he locks the door, ignoring a more powerful ghost or more. So it's, to do with I think, an idea of suicide and the reasons why people might commit suicide, and how those are to do with internal haunting rather than external hauntings. So yeah, pretty dark, intense poem. I think it has a positive and motivational message though, so it's important to remember that when there's these kind of difficult or dark things that we confront, the intention behind them is actually to heal or to improve people's lives. So the idea is to kind of make you aware that there should be aspects of yourself that you know better, or to kind of be cautious of your mind trapping itself in certain ways, and be able to kind of deal with and confront traumas rather than hiding them away because they might crop up at random times. So there's two concepts here, internal and external ghosts. The internal are more frightening, according to the speaker. These are things that give feelings that we get stressed by: panic, horror, terror, dread. And the speaker wonders why society is focused on their fear of external supernatural ghosts in the world, because she feels like internal ones are more frightening. This is a kind of anti-spiritual or anti-religious, more practical approach as well. Sort of the 19th century, when Dickinson's writing, people are very, very obsessed with the supernatural and the presence of ghosts in the world and, kind of spooky things. I really like that stuff myself, so I can't really judge them for it. But Dickinson, I think, in some ways, quite often rejects kind of overly spiritual beliefs that seem unfounded to her quite often. And she tends to be a bit more practical. So what she's saying is look at your internal psychology rather than caring too much about whether you should do a seance and try and contact the dead, or whether you're going to encounter a ghost if you go to a haunted place. And for her, that's more frightening. So we have language devices, extended metaphor of the mind being like a house in the first stanza. We have a lot of Gothic imagery, so the entire poem is extremely Gothic. This idea of an abbey is a characteristic Gothic setting. The idea of horror, ghost, spectre, they're all allusions to Gothic literature, which you can look more into if you're interested in that kind of thing. Having a general awareness of Gothic would actually help you have a more specific awareness of this poem. There's also a bit of a tautology that is confusing but really central to the poem. This idea of being ourself behind ourself concealed. On first glance, it seems like this line makes no sense. And underneath, it feels like there are actually several layers to the self or mind, and that some of those darker, deeper aspects of the self are really hidden, not only from other people, but from our own selves. Like, we don't quite know ourselves as well as we should sometimes. So it's actually a kind of call to something called self-actualization, that we should all try and understand ourselves as much as possible and confront all of the different aspects of ourselves, even if we've been bad, or even if we're trying to ignore something. You should actually try and dredge it up and confront it, because it's going to help you a lot more in your life than if you just sort of bury it and it suddenly crops up at a random time which you weren't expecting. So yeah, the idea of layers of self or layers of the mind is quite interesting. And I think personally I find it a more helpful approach to psychology than thinking of the self as a single fixed thing. There's a lot of rhetorical language, so it actually seems like it's trying to be a very persuasive poem. She's aware that she's presenting a bit of an unusual perspective here to her audience. And so, yeah, she's quite assertive with her argument that she presents in this poem. So in terms of structure, we have an opening line that uses negation. One need not be a chamber to be haunted. It's a very surprising, confusing place for your reader to start with a poem. It seems almost humorous or whimsical in a way, like it's conversational. And then we have this variety of line length that goes through. Sometimes the lines are dimeter even, they're very short. And sometimes they're much longer. So you want to pay attention to the length of the line and see, why do you think sometimes it's short and abrupt? It might be shocking, for example, at that point. There's also the dashes, which create pauses and tension. The ending is, like I say, particularly shocking, a little bit frightening, I think intended as a warning that the body doesn't take, don't allow your body to take over from your mind. Don't allow the ghosts in your own head to sort of control you. And a lot of what Dickinson does, I think, with her poetry, because a lot of it sometimes is not actually intended for a public audience. It's kind of so she can understand herself and humanity better. So she's sort of trying to process things. And yeah, we'll get to context on that in a second. So as a task for the attitudes, I want you to think about ghosts. Do you believe in ghosts or not? Why? How do you interpret this idea that the mind can be haunted? And what do you think a ghost of the mind might be? And do you agree with the argument that interior ghosts are worse than external ghosts? So you can think about that, and ideally just kind of jot down all of your thoughts on that, because it's important when you read a poem that your own beliefs react with the attitudes of the poem, and sometimes those will agree and sometimes they might clash or conflict as well. So, in terms of Dickinson, what she thinks, I think she definitely is exploring the idea that there are hidden depths to our mind and soul that we can struggle to access sometimes. There's also the idea that the mind can be haunted, similar to houses. And there's also the idea that material, physical reality is actually not as much of a threat to us as our own minds or even spiritual problems. So you have this idea that the physical world can't really ever harm us, or the external world can't harm us as much as the internal. So in some ways, that's a sort of we do have these types of ideas in modern society as well. The idea that you should, if you focus on strengthening yourself and building yourself and getting in a good place in your own mind, you become more able to interact positively with the world around you, and you can have a better effect on everything that you interact with. So so it's kind of about the idea that growth for an individual should come from the internal, not the external. So this idea that she's exploring really reminds me of Freudian psychoanalysis. If you take psychology as a discipline, Freud is generally considered not a super scientific psychologist. So just be careful with him in a scientific sense. But in terms of his literary merit, or the ability that he has to help us understand quite abstract or kind of complex ideas about the self, I find him quite useful in some ways and quite crazy in others. So you can kind of separate the crazy bits of him from the useful. So I've explored the idea that he actually split the mind into conscious, subconscious, and unconscious. So you can read more about that here and elsewhere if you find it interesting. I also feel like this is a poem, like a lot of Dickinson's poems, that explores the effect of post-traumatic stress disorder. And that's kind of a condition where when you've had a trauma, you've suffered something that was shocking or frightening, your brain starts to just react differently, and chemically it can change as a result to that. And you can, through therapy, shift that back again. So sometimes you can recover quite quickly from post-traumatic stress, and sometimes it's chronic, it lasts a long time, and it takes a lot of work to fix it. It just reminds me of the idea that if you've had these shocks, they kind of change your brain a little bit. If you're looking at it from a more scientific perspective of how the brain functions, you could interpret it as an exploration of PTSD. So I think this poem sort of relates a little bit to the idea of her withdrawal from society. So Dickinson was a very social person in her early life. And then in the 1860s, she kind of transitions to being quite reclusive and not really spending much time out and about in her town, not really traveling anywhere. She is still social, but only in a kind of domestic context centered around her own family home. And she does write to people, but in terms of letters, or she talks to people that visit her house, because her house was quite, or her family was quite a prominent family. So we have this idea that there's an extreme shock or loss of someone close to her, maybe, or maybe just some sort of difficulty in her life that made her really frightened, and that might have caused a change in behavior. So finally, there's a load of tasks here. If you've got time, I want you to just make little mind maps or kind of sketch out these different themes and how each theme relates to the poem. You might look at quotes that relate to each theme, or you might just kind of generally write your thoughts and notes on it as well. So hopefully that was a useful interpretation of this poem. If you're feeling more confident on it, and I'll see you guys in a future lesson.